Today my guest is Steve Bohlen. Steve, how are you?
Good, Dave. How are you today?
I'm doing great.
Good.
What do you do?
Well, so I am presently the technical lead and community evangelist for the Spring.net project from Spring Source VMware.
Okay. I know you do a lot of speaking around the country, and I've heard you speak a lot about Agile. In fact, you first came to my attention for your screencasts, one of which is the Autumn of Agile.
Yep.
Let's talk about Agile.
Okay, sure. Let's do that.
We've talked about Agile on the show before, but we haven't really defined it, I don't think. What is Agile?
Well, so Agile is one of those interesting things which has come to be meaning a lot of things that it was never really intended to mean. And so Agile sort of began way back when in the early 2001, 2002 time period, where a number of people who had been doing software engineering for many, many years came together and realized that there were a lot of commonalities in what they were doing, even though there were also a lot of differences. And so out of that came something called the Agile Manifesto, which essentially is a series of left-right value propositions. So what it basically says is that the Agile Manifesto says that when you're developing software, you should have a set of values that kind of goes like this, right? So the first value is that we should value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? The second one is that we should value working software over comprehensive documentation. The third one is that we should value customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And the last principle is that we should value responding to change over following a plan. Okay, and so the premise is, and this is where some of the miscommunication about Agile comes in, is that people assume that what that means is that those things on the left, right, individual interactions, working software, customer collaboration, and responding to change, should be instead of the other things. So instead of...
It doesn't say instead of.
Right, no, it doesn't say instead of, right?
It says over.
That's right. We value the things on the left more than the things on the right, which ultimately, if you actually sort of tear it apart and think about it, isn't that controversial a statement, right? The idea that we should value working software over comprehensive documentation basically says, if you've got 100 hours to do something, and your choice would be to spend 100 hours getting perfect documentation, or 100 hours getting a working piece of software, then you should choose to do the working piece of software over the documentation, right? More business value there probably, right? So on its surface, there's really not much controversy in there. A lot of the confusion with Agile is, as I say, people sort of take that manifesto and say, well, the things on the left are valuable, therefore the things on the right have no value whatsoever. And that's certainly not the proposition, but it is the source of a lot of confusion when people start talking about Agile. And in fact, a lot of the sort of bad reputation that Agile got early on was from people taking the values on the left and discarding the things on the right, saying Agile means I don't have to do documentation. Agile means I don't have to have a plan and follow it, right? Agile doesn't mean any of those things. It means that you shouldn't value those over the other values. And so ultimately, from that manifesto, right, which really is just a value proposition of relative values of things, comes the whole rest of everything else, right? Whether it's Scrum, whether it's XP, all of the rest of these methodologies that call themselves Agile are essentially ways to try and codify that value proposition, right? And so ultimately, that's what Agile means, right? Agile is the implementation of having understood and internalized and agreed to that value system, is an attempt to sort of codify that process in your software engineering activity so that you're respecting that value system.
Okay, well, let's talk a little about why that's important and how it's applied to the software projects that you work on.
Sure. So I think one of the very early things that you begin to realize in software engineering, and I come at this from I used to be a practicing architect in building architecture. So in a sense, when I came
used to be a biochemist.
There you go. See, it happens a lot in this industry, right? That people come to it from other professions, and I think one of the very interesting things to me was that when I started to get involved in software engineering, there were all of these words we use that were the same words that we had borrowed from my building profession,
like architect,
like engineer, even the terms we use, building software, right? Makes it feel like we're constructing a building, right? These kinds of things. So, and just like building a building, we often have a requirements phase. We have a design phase. We have an actual produce the thing, build the thing phase, right?
Sure.
So there are a lot of these allegories that make their way that are borrowed from the physical construction.
There's a lot of design documents involved in a building.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, there are. And so when I first came to software engineering, all of that felt very, very natural to me. because hey, this was these were terms that had very clear meaning to me in my work as a building architect. And when I came to software, what I realized was at first, wow, this is easy. It maps one-to-one to what I used to do, right? The problem with that, however, is that obviously there are many things much different about building software than building buildings. And it took me a while in my career before I sort of latched on to those differences and began to understand where they were really important. And so one of the areas where it's so important is kind of comes back to understanding why we call software in the first place, right? Which is to distinguish it from hardware.
Okay.
And why do we call hardware hard and software soft? It's because hardware is hard to change and software should be easy to change,
okay.
right? That's the premise there.
Okay.
And so when we start building software projects as though we're building buildings, what I find is that we're really building hardware. It's really hard to change, right?
I see.
And so
we're not acknowledging the fact that software is more malleable.
That's right.
Than
That's right.
girders are.
Right. And so as my canonical example for this is when I was an architect, one of the reasons why we have such an extensive planning and design phase as a building architect is because once you pour the foundation in concrete, if you make a mistake, or not even a mistake, right? If now it comes time to build the first floor and you realize the basement needs to change a little, that's very expensive to do, right? You're tearing out the concrete, you're backing up the whole schedule in the project, you're doing all of that, right? And so in software, we don't quite have that, or at least we shouldn't, right? A lot of the way people build software, unfortunately, is such that it's really expensive to make changes to it. But if you build software the way it was sort of originally conceived of, with this flexibility in mind, then it becomes possible to not quite spend as much time doing the planning.
Yeah.
Because the cost of change is much less, right? Done right. And so I think that what it comes down to for me is that a lot of the Agile practices are about helping you to ensure that your software remains malleable and flexible and able to respond to change as you come further along in the process.
All right. And let's talk about some of the specific examples that we as architects and as developers can change the way we think about software to become more agile.
Sure. So one of the things that I think comes to mind, fairly early is this notion of how we approach building the software, right? We usually build it sort of from these low levels and then we build up on top, right? So we might start with a database and on top of that data access and maybe on top of that eventually some business rules and eventually we sort of put the icing on the top, the user interface layer.
Yep,
kind
I've
of
done
thing,
that many
right?
times.
Lots of people do, right? I mean, it's the traditional sort of architecture layer cake diagram
Sure.
that many people build software solutions with. And by the way, from an architectural perspective, there's probably nothing inherently wrong with that diagram. There are other diagrams that are possible to build too, but that diagram in and of itself isn't bad. The problem is how we approach building it,
right.
where we start at the bottom, we work our way up, right?
Right.
And the challenge we run into with that is that if the project gets stopped midway, so for example, and stop, by the way, doesn't necessarily need to be we're cutting your funding, project's over, right? It could be your company is taken over and your project is being evaluated, right? Right. Should we continue to fund this now that the business has been absorbed by someone else, kind of a thing,
Sure,
right?
or the resources are temporarily moved away to some other project.
Yep, could be anything, right? And so when that happens, if you started building sort of the layer cake diagram from the bottom up, if you stop midway, then you sort of have nothing to show. You got a lot of bits in the source code repository.
Nothing the end user can use.
Nothing that can be used, right? And unfortunately, not only nothing that can be used, but you probably don't even have anything worth demonstrating, right? You can't even say, well, here's some of the functionality, because you don't really have any functionality yet, because you never got to sort of that UI, that icing on the top of the cake layer, right? So what Agile suggests is that it would be better to actually slice and dice that diagram into vertical slices rather than horizontal slices in terms of the way you approach doing the work. So that it would be possible to say, let's build this whole feature, right? And the feature, it doesn't matter what the feature is, but the point is that all of the bits in the feature are there, right? So persistence, data access, the business rule, the UI, the whole thing, that one feature is built. And so by itself, it probably doesn't deliver a tremendous amount of business value, but it's demonstrable progress, right?
Right.
You can take that feature and you can show it to an end user and say, is this what you had in mind, right? Because one of the challenges that we run into in building software frequently is what I call and others have too, this challenge of building the thing right versus building the right thing. right?
Okay.
So when we have a plan where we debrief the users 17 months ago and start building the thing, right? What we're doing is we're building to that specification,
Right.
which even if you assume that process was perfect, represents their needs 18 months ago.
Which may change.
Which may have changed, right? And so if you just keep following that plan, and this goes back to that idea of responding to change versus following a plan, right? If you just blindly follow that plan, yes, you're done, right? You built the thing to spec. Everybody's happy, everybody goes home, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you built it right, but you may not have built the right thing because the user's needs may have changed, right? And so part of the point of Agile is to be able to reduce a lot of these feedback loops, right? Traditional software, whether it's waterfall or whatever process you're using, tends to have very long, broad feedback loops.
Right.
Teams will disappear into their desks and not come out of their cubicles for weeks, months at a time sometimes. And what that means is that that duration of time is the minimum amount of time that they could be going in the wrong direction,
Right.
without knowing it, right? And so Agile says if we build a feature, then part of the advantage of building that feature is that if someone pulls the plug on the project, we've at least got something that works. But more importantly, as we deliver those features, we're able to actually show them to the end users and get their feedback. Is this what you had in mind, right? I think we've all had that experience of going to the customer with the built piece of software and saying, here you go. And they go, what is that? That's not what I asked for, right? That's not what I meant, right? And you can flip open the spec and say, look, here on page 422,
I know I said
this
that.
is exactly
I
what you
didn't,
asked for.
But I meant this.
Yeah, but that's not what I meant, right? It's what I said, it's not what I meant. It's kind of like marriage in that regard.
I have no comment on
Right.
this.
But that's
that
the,
tight feedback loop
Mhm.
is a big part of Agile.
it's a huge part of Agile, and feedback at a lot of different levels, right? So we're discussing sort of building vertical slices of our application as a way to get feedback from the end user, from the business user. But we also look in Agile at other feedback loops. So one of the key ideas in a lot of Agile is this notion of test-driven development, or at least the notion of having unit tests for our software.
Yep.
And that's about a feedback loop that is at the sort of individual developer level, right? As soon as I make a change to the code, I can run the tests and I can know what the impact of that change was.
The test runners will tell me.
Yep.
Give me feedback right away.
Absolutely. Did I break
Oops, I
something?
broke something.
Right? If I did break something, did I mean to break it? Right? A failing test doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I need to undo what I just did. It may mean that, yes, that test I broke is no longer really the right test, right? It's not valid given this new capability we've added to the system. But
at least I know that.
that's right. That's right. You know it, and you know it real quick, right? Because part of looking at effectively working on software is this notion that the longer a problem remains in the solution, right, unaddressed, the more expensive it is to fix. And we've all experienced this as software developers, where as we're writing the code, certainly we've got the lines of code on the screen, but we've also got this mental picture in our head of all the variables and all of the method calls and all of the relationships between the code we're writing at that moment and the whole rest of the software. And we've taken some time to build that picture because we talk a lot about the notion of how much uninterrupted time you need as a software engineer, right? You get in the zone, right? And it takes time to get into that zone, and when you're knocked out of the zone, it takes time to get back into it again. So if you add a bug and it goes undiscovered for even an hour or two, never mind a day or two or a week or two or a month or two, when that problem eventually comes back to you, you have to get that whole mental picture back in your head again, right? In order to solve the problem. You have to rebuild the mental model of the code you wrote in order to begin to solve whatever the bug is. And so the notion of the type feedback loop is the cheapest time to fix the bug is right after you wrote the bug. Right? Immediately after you wrote the bug, because the mental model's even probably still in your head at that point.
And you know what you just changed.
Absolutely.
So you know where to look.
Yep, absolutely. And so the notion of the tests in a lot of Agile methodologies is this idea that that's a feedback loop that's personal to me as a developer. As soon as I make a change, I can know, did I break something? Did I not break something? What's the effect of that change on the system, right? And when we look at other feedback loops in Agile, we talk about a lot of Agile teams will rely on continuous integration as a practice, right? Which is this notion that we have one sort of central canonical view of the truth for our solution, and there it is out there in a place where anytime anybody brings code and adds to that trunk of our solution, some process, whatever it might be, running somewhere, will recognize that that's happened, check that code out, build it, and potentially also run tests and do other analysis on it in order to make sure that it's healthy and in a good state.
Right.
And that's a feedback loop at the team level, right? So in the same way that the unit tests tell me when I just did something that broke, if you commit code and it breaks the build, now I know you did something, right? And I know not to touch that because it's dangerous, right? If I pull from the source repository at that point, well, it's no good. It's known bad, right? Because somebody puts something in there that won't compile or won't pass a test or whatever. The last thing I want to do is pollute my local copy of the code with something I know is broken, right? That's obviously going to be counterproductive because now I've got my own problems and I've just assumed yours too, right? And I don't want that.
So we've got the type view that, well, somebody broke the build, immediately have that person fix the build.
Absolutely.
While that picture's in his
Yep. In the same way that once I break a unit test, right, I want to immediately fix that problem, right?
Yeah.
And so all of these things are about a couple of things, right? They're about tight feedback loops, but they're also more than anything, they're about sharing information about the result of those feedback loops, right? So if I break a unit test in my own workstation, the odds are you're not going to know about it.
Right.
But if I break a test in the build, everybody's going to know about it, right? That's a real good sort of heartbeat ability for the whole team to see what's going on in the project. There's none of this magical, you go off into a corner for a month and a half and then, why don't you bring your feature and stick it in the trunk? We'll see what happens.
Right.
But let's do that like 3 days before we release, right? So we have time to make it all work.
It may not even be broken until it merges.
Until you merge, that's right.
Maybe
So,
something in my code which works fine and something in your code works fine, but together they collide.
And that's how you get the, it works on my machine sort of thing, right? But doesn't work anywhere else. And so we have those feedback loops at the individual level, at the team level, and at the customer level. And the idea is that Agile is about, more than anything else, transparency of process, right? A lot of the misunderstandings that led to, in past software projects, that led to some of the ideas behind Agile are the result of miscommunication between software engineers and business people, right? Where we have a process that feels to a business person like a black box. They don't understand it. All they know is they write the big, thick requirements doc, we disappear for 18 months, we come back, we deliver them not what they wanted. That's the black box process, right? And so part of Agile, and an essential component of Agile, is engaging the business in the process, right? So that they're able to see and are aware of what's going on. And so all of these visible indicators, whether it's a continuous integration build or it's things like the burn down charts and the backlogs of our user stories and all of these kinds of things, are all visibility into our process, right? Essentially, it's taking that secret project spreadsheet that used to just be on my computer, and maybe I'd share it with the team, probably not, but I certainly wouldn't tell the business, right? So we're behind schedule. We better not tell the business, right? What we do in Agile is, as soon as something like that happens, as soon as a change occurs, it's going to affect our deliverables. We immediately engage the business in that conversation because ultimately, part of deciding what to do about unexpected change needs to involve the business making decisions, right? So, it may be the case that the business is getting ready for some product launch, and it's actually more important that they make the product launch date than that they get this new feature in.
Right.
Or it might be
make that call.
And the business gets to make that call, right? And all too often what happens is the software teams go off into their own little black box and try to mask that problem.
Sure.
And then the business discovers it the day before the launch, and you say, well, it's going to be 2 weeks, and they say, well, but we have this gigantic ad campaign going on right now. What are we going to do, right? It's too late then.
Right.
So it's about it's all about transparency and trying to get these feedback loops much tighter, so that the duration of time during which you can be accidentally going in the wrong direction is much smaller.
Yeah, the last company I worked for was very heavily committed to Scrum,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that they preached on was these sprints, these short sprints,
Yep.
a week or two,
Mm-hmm.
at most. They would never went beyond 2
Right.
weeks, and that was part of the reason. Is now we got feedback every 2 weeks, something to deliver to the end user, something for them to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
say, make corrections to, and also it forced that conversation to take place as to, is it time to adjust?
Yep.
Every 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
We reprioritized every 2 weeks.
Yep. Well, and that's one of the it's one of the interesting things is I think part of the reason that the 800-page spec has entered the lore of bad software practices, right? But part of the reason that it was there in the first place was because businesses, as part of the process we had been following as software engineers, had been conditioned to believe that they only got one bite at the apple.
Yeah, so
right.
They threw
so
as much as
so
they
if you
could
want it,
possibly
it sure as hell better be in that spec.
Right.
And so of course they throw in everything in the kitchen sink, right? And that's how you get these insane requirements that make no sense. But someone saying, you know what, I'll add that even if I don't want it. I think it's about the size of something I might want, so maybe I'll trade it off later, right? But they throw everything in,
Sure.
right? And this is how you end up with
It's really
these.
hard to prioritize.
Of course not, right? And of course, what's the priority, right? Well, everything in the spec, right? So everything's priority one.
Right.
So by engaging the business and actually sort of teaching them, in a sense, that this new process gives them the ability to have multiple bites at the apple, right? Every 2 weeks, you can change your mind. You just have to live with the consequences of changing your mind, right? But at the end of every iteration, you get to participate in reprioritizing the work for the team, right?
Yep.
And so you actually get so many bites at the apple that in some cases, in fact, what happens is the business says, would you please stop inviting me to these meetings? Because I just don't have time to do this, right? And that's the flip side of Agile, is that not all organizations are really equipped to engage at that level, right?
Okay.
And one of the big problems, I think, with Agile is that it's not the case that I think it's impossible to do Agile when it's only the development staff that's sort of accepting Agile, right? But what will happen, if you think about it for a second, is that the software development team, being Agile, will start to have these ripple effects outward into the rest of the organization. So whether on the front side, in terms of the requirements coming in, whether it's the business constantly being, maybe they don't have new ideas every 2 weeks. Maybe they have new ideas every 6 months, right? So they're not structured to have new ideas every 2 weeks. And so they need to think about re-engineering their upfront business process to take advantage of the fact that it's okay to have new ideas every 2 weeks,
Yeah,
right?
and sometimes just the feedback that they get from seeing the results of their last idea, that sparks something.
Very much
They
so.
say, this is good, but we can do it a slightly different
Very much
way.
so. Right, and you get the pushback in the other direction too, where once development is done, now it comes time for ops to deploy this thing, right? Well, is ops really ready to deploy something every 2 weeks? Right? Maybe yes, maybe no, right?
Yeah.
And so what happens is I think part of the challenge with successful Agile adoption, right, is certainly that a lot of people want to do sort of, pull it off the shelf and take the Agile tool, and that'll mean I'm doing Agile, and that's obviously insane, right?
Right.
I mean, me owning a plane doesn't make me a pilot any more than me going to a Scrum class makes me Agile. So the point is that that's certainly one of the reasons for failure. But one of the other reasons for failure is that it's not the kind of thing that is as effective if just the software development team does it. It's significantly more effective if it's the entire organization. If you think about the software development pipeline from the inception of the idea, or even the understanding of the need, right? Like, we need a software thing to do X, right? From the point at which that is agreed upon, yes, you're right, we should build something that does that. All the way to the end where that software product that does X is delivered, if that entire value chain is optimized to take advantage of these tight feedback loops and is optimized with transparency in there, then it's much more successful than if this middle part that's about constructing software is transparent and open and iterative, right?
That's
the whole thing has to be...
That's a little bit discouraging. Like, let's say that I am someone, I'm in a software department, I want to be more Agile, I recognize the value of that. Do I need to convince my entire organization front to back?
No.
In order to be successful?
It's a great question, right? I think the easy answer is yes, if you want to maximize the benefit of your being Agile, right? I think that my experience is that that's definitely the case. However, I would say no, not if you view, sort of you being, because we think, right, software construction is sort of in the middle of the process, right? There's this business need on the one end, and there's, delivering and deploying on the other end, and software construction happens in the middle. If there are benefits to optimizing just that, but they're not as great as optimizing the whole. Right?
Okay, so there's some hope you can get some.
Well, there is,
successes, and maybe somebody will see those successes.
Well, exactly, and that's what I find is that if you don't do it at the organization level, right? So if the pitch to we should be Agile is to the software development team lead, not to your CTO or your CEO, right? If the pitch is in lower down in the org chart, so to speak, then what will happen in the best case scenario? What will happen is that the things that feed that pipeline will realize that, hey, how come every 2 weeks they're asking me for new stuff, right? And they'll start to, again, adjust themselves to take advantage of the fact that they get this new bite at the apple every 2 weeks or whatever the iteration length is, right? And on the operations side, and deployment in those kinds of QA for that matter, right? Whatever happens after the software building part, those downstream parts of the organization will also begin to feel pressure, because what will happen is the business will say to the ops people, well, I don't understand. these guys just built it. They demoed it to us yesterday.
Why can't I
What
see
do you
it?
mean I can't see it on my desk for another 9 months, right? And so what will happen is again, it's that transparency thing, is that the act of doing this will show up where the choke points are in your whole organization's pipeline, right? In a good way, right? Done wrong, right? And this is the danger, is that done wrong, what happens is it makes the people on the front and the people on the end very defensive, right? And that's the danger. Done right, it gives the people on the end an opportunity and the people on the beginning an opportunity as well, right? And so that's really where I think, you can do the change starting from the middle and working out rather than starting at the top and working down. But it's a longer process, obviously, if the whole organization doesn't buy into it, and you're not getting as much value, right? But obviously, one of the reasons that Agile, I think, has been not, there are probably more Agile failure stories than there are Agile success stories, right? And I think the reason for that is a lot of what we're talking about here, where to be really successful, you got to get buy-in from the whole value chain in the organization, and depending on the size of your organization and its structure, and for that matter, its history, right, and its needs, that's a challenge. Like I know, for example, I'd heard a story about a team doing Agile, and what they do is they build software that runs their factory's robotic assembly line things, right, and this is the software that controls the robots that build the circuit boards or something. Now, every 2 weeks, you're not going to shut the factory down and retool the assembly line because there's some new thing they released, right? So there's a scenario where the idea of, hey, you know what, every 2 weeks I deliver something, every 2 weeks you should deploy it, is never going to happen, right? And it's not going to happen because the organization says...
Well, you don't deploy it in production, you can still deploy it to some other area.
Exactly, and that's what happens, right, is what you do is you queue up these sort of 6-month batches worth of value, right? So every 6 months, in whatever it might be, December, whenever it might be, they shut down the assembly line and retool, but they've got everything else done. They've got it through QA. They've got the entire. It's got a bow on it. It's ready to go.
Okay.
And those are situations where part of Agile, effectively, I think, is looking at the way Agile is often done and applying appropriate context to it. Right. Make sure what you're doing makes sense for your business. Don't read a book on Agile and immediately come into work on Monday saying, okay, we must do all of these things or we're going to be a failure.
Okay. Let's wrap up. Tell me about. Your web presence, promote it to my. I have about 100,000 viewers.
100,000 viewers, awesome. That's great. So I have I have a fairly robust online presence. I blog at unhandled-exceptions.com. I have a number of screencasts that I've recorded over the years. Certainly, there's a 15 part series on Hibernate called Summer of Hibernate at summerofinhibernate.com. I also do a lot of public speaking, as you mentioned early on, and a lot of those videos are online as well. Most of them with links from my blog and so on. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. I'm also involved in a number of open source software projects, certainly in Hibernate, but also NDB Unit, which is a utility for putting a database into a consistent state in order to assert unit tests against it.
Sounds like a good idea for another show.
It could be, and obviously I'm also currently the technical lead for the Spring.NET project. So I have a fairly decent footprint in the .NET open source space. I'm a big believer in community and contributions and those kinds of things. And I think that whether it's public speaking at community events or it's encouraging people to contribute to open source software and collaborate with their peers, all of those are things I think that help make not only the participants better, so the act and experience of doing that is ultimately beneficial for the people involved who do contribute.
Agree 100%.
But I think it also results in a sort of more robust community for all, the more people that participate, certainly.
I agree. Steve, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate you having me. So one thing that's certainly been true of my experiences in technology has been an opportunity for me to get to know a lot of people, and certainly most of them I count them as my friends, you included.
Thank you.
You're welcome.